In this brief lecture, we will look more deeply at the concept of digital theology. Specifically, we're going to look at issues related to debates and directions that conversations around digital theology and the concept of digital ecclesiology are emerging. In this session, we're going to draw on and relate to discussions that happen in chapter 1 of the book Digital Ecclesiology, a Global Conversation, and the introduction, which is titled An Introduction to Digital Ecclesiology. What does a conversation on digital ecclesiology look like? So in this lecture, I'll introduce the concept of digital theology and digital ecclesiology and define the parameters of what discussions in these areas focus on, especially in relation to the conversations that emerge through this edited ebook, Digital Ecclesiology. So first, what is digital theology? Digital theology has become a term that's become quite popular to use in the past decade, and especially in the last 5 years. And there's much debate around the scholars who use this term, that to what extent is this a new discipline into itself, or is it a sub-discipline or area of theology, or is it even an interdisciplinary conversation that reaches beyond the bounds of just theology? Digital theology is emerging in many different ways, and so it's hard to put a finger on it. But from my perspective, it's an interesting interdisciplinary conversation. And it's an interdisciplinary conversation that covers a lot of different areas. This includes looking at digital tools to study theology. So some conversations take what we would call a digital humanities perspective and looking at what digital resources, computer programs, and devices can we develop to help better study the understanding of theology in contemporary society. Another area that digital theology covers is applying Christian ethics to digital tech use. So there's been many conversations and concerns about to what extent is the digital realm and digital technologies, from computers to the internet and smartphones, how are they ethically impacting religious communities, religious identity, and faith expressions? And so looking at the ethical implications and the debates around them is also another important area. There's also a third area of digital theology that looks at the study of God in and for a digital culture. And here's where we get really into the idea of if theology could be understood, as Anselm says, as faith-seeking understanding, what do we need to understand about the relationship to God and digital culture? How do we see that? And how might we interpret and use that as a springboard to think about how the church needs to adapt, adopt, or respond to different areas? And finally, digital theology, it can be looked at as a new theological understanding of humanity. It's an area that looks at kind of how discussions in computer science, in post-humanism, in other areas of biotechnology and nanotechnology, how these kind of integrations of technology with humanity intersect, and how this changes our understanding and perception of what it means to be human in this era. But to give a kind of starting point definition, I draw on the work of the Center for Digital Theology that is now at Spurgeon College, and they offer this definition. Digital theology involves reflecting on the digitization of culture, the embeddedness of technologies in our everyday lives, and the implications of this for the Christian faith and its practices. So here I am most interested in my work in digital theology really focus on ethical issues, as well as how do we study God and understand human relationships in a digital age. So touching on the latter three of the 4 areas I just pointed out. So when I think about digital theology and when I have conversations about it, I think a couple of things are important to keep in context from my understanding and part in helping develop this field is first that I see digital theology as an extension of the work that is done in digital religion studies and has pioneered. So digital religion studies or research has developed over the last 2 decades as a way to particularly approach how religion is practiced in the digital age. Digital religion studies looks in tandem both at how religion is practiced in digital environments and online, but also how that is impacting larger conversations about religion, spirituality, and different traditions. So it looks at the intersection of the online and offline, how religion is being shaped by digital culture, and how that digital culture is then shaping traditional religious communities and conversations. And so with that in mind, I believe that digital theology should be focused on conversations and topics that focus on what is happening in terms of religious practice and Christian practice online, how the church is especially adapting in this era, and especially during this period of the pandemic, when they had to make a lot of adaptations to this new environment. How is traditional religion adapting to digital culture, and what does the merger intersection look like? Many people are talking about this idea of hybrid worship. So how does a church that has online and offline components interact, see itself, and define its mission? I also believe, and in much of my work with theology, I take what's called a contextual theological approach. Here, it's a contextual approach is basically naming your perspective, naming your background, and how that informs how you see things. And so it's kind of partially a personal act of kind of identifying and proclaiming the uniqueness of your perspective and the contribution it offers. But I believe that digital theology, as a broad conversation, has a lot to offer in challenging kind of not just how people talk about digital work and digital technologies in theological realms, but also how we understand humanity and treat the other in these discourses. I believe firmly that digital theology should be prophetic rather than reactionary toward technology. The idea to develop the prophetic voice in a relationship to media has been pioneered by the work of Clifford Christians. And he talks about, just as the prophet Micah, stood at a higher perspective to see what was happening, to know how Israel should respond, that digital theology should also kind of look at where we've come from, where we are now, and where we're going based on the kind of ideas that we grasp and adhere to. Digital theology needs to look at kind of the new generations of technology that are coming related to augmented reality, robotics and AI, as well as the ingrained technologies of the internet, mobile media, and the like. Finally, digital theology needs to kind of look seriously at the post-human condition. So post-humanism is a philosophy and a belief that humanity is evolving into something more than what they are now, something that is beyond the human experience and the human form, and that technology will play a large role in that. So, at its most extreme, the post-human philosophy would look at the idea of kind of brain downloading, like we saw in the movie Transcendence with Johnny Depp, where his brain was downloaded into computers, and then he became this new kind of consciousness. That's at the very extreme, but we, in many ways, are cyborgs, as Donna Haraway says, because whether it's our glasses and regenerative medicines that are extending our body and our life and abilities, to kind of how wearable technologies and technologies that are becoming more and more part of monitoring our physical lives. So we need to engage with kind of what this understanding of this new humanity or the direction humanity may be evolving, and understand it both as a popular discourse, but also as a discourse that is guiding a lot of decisions that are made in government policy and about expectations of digital literacy and engagement with technology and culture. So digital theology, a new area of study, is still emerging and finding its own definition and identity, but an exciting field to be involved in. And within this area of digital theology, one of the areas that is emerging in conversation and that I'm trying to pioneer and be part of is that of digital ecclesiology. And this is showcased in the book, Digital Ecclesiology, A Global Conversation, an ebook that I produced during the pandemic. The aim of this book was really to facilitate a global conversation about how the forced migration of churches all around the world online was raising not just short-term, but long-term questions about how these experiences would shape the theology, the outlook, and especially what it means to be the church in this age. This book brought together scholars from both Protestant and Catholic backgrounds from countries such as Singapore, Brazil, South Africa, and Nigeria. And it also brought together different denominational perspectives. We have Lutheran, we have a Methodist, we have Pentecostal, we have even Catholic perspectives, and others from different mixed traditions. But in all of these essays in this book that I put together, the aim was to kind of not just feature people telling the stories of what happened during the pandemic when churches went online, but really begin to drill down on what are the broader implications as more and more churches embrace digital media and integrate digital technologies into their presence, their community, their way of life, and how they do services. So what are the issues about how we understand what it means to be a Christian community and the nature of the church? So in this book, I invited these different theologians from around the world that are colleagues of mine or people I've interacted with in different contexts. And I gave them 3 orienting questions to write a brief essay of less than 3,000 words. So these questions were, what theological resources are there that can help people research the current struggles, such as social distancing, churches being closed, non-contact community reality? So what are the resources, not just in terms of specific books, but what are the specific doctrines, concepts, and metaphors that have been helpful in the past that we can employ to explain what's going on, but also to wrestle with the implications of the choices being made? The second question was, what theological issues are raised for institutional churches as they move to an online and technologically mediated house or church model at this time? So kind of what does it mean to be an online church, and how do they understand the nature of their church when they were a fully online entity, and now as they're transitioning many into these hybrid existences? And finally, what might current experiments with doing church during this pandemic and doing it online and the predicted social conditions of the post-pandemic shape future ecclesiology? So looking at how kind of, the debates about mental health and church staff, debate ideas and conversations about what it needs to be spiritual resilient in times of change, issues about how to deal with crisis and within the Christian community, and how do we build faith rather than fear. These are all important issues that scholars looked at from different perspectives. But to wrap up this brief introduction, I just want to put forward what is the idea of digital ecclesiology, and also how does it differ from the concept of digital theology? Well, ecclesiology in the broad sense is a study of the structures, practices, and patterns of the church. So this means that when people do ecclesiology work, they're looking at things like, liturgy. How is liturgy developed, and how does that frame the church? What are the structures, whether it be kind of government or authority structures, as well as kind of patterns of practice such as religious education? What does it mean to be the church? And what is digital ecclesiology means, what does it mean to be the church online and in the digital age? How does our digital integration impact structures, practices, and patterns of our church, especially in its online and hybrid forms? So much of the discussion and even the use of the term digital ecclesiology and even digital theology has been used initially to talk about what the best practices are for using digital platforms to do church. But here, specifically, the term digital ecclesiology is not referring to solely the practice, but it is trying to lean on the theological questions that these practices generate. For example, how does technology use alter the purpose and ethos of the church itself? And how does it change how people understand what it means to be in community with one another? I believe that addressing these ecclesiology issues emerging from the church's current digital experimentation is very important because people have taken many different forms in these new types of technologically mediated worship. Some have rethought their whole worship service and started new liturgies or patterns of worship at the offset of the pandemic. Other people have been trying to kind of look at how do they adapt and transfer their services online. But how do these practices, and especially as the church worship service is often considered one of the defining characteristics of the identity of a church, how is this being brought into the digital realm, creating new challenges, especially for how we understand things like being metaphors like the body of Christ, or even the people of God. So in this book, Digital Ecclesiology, and in this introductory chapter, I try to highlight some of these kind of questions that emerge. I'm challenging and contextualizing what the essays in this book talk about considering what the future of religion might look like in the social, cultural, and religious changes brought on by the current pandemic. And some of the themes that get picked up in the book are looking at the relevance of previous or historic models of the church. To what extent do the metaphors of our models, like the body of Christ, still hold true, or do we need new models to talk about what we're seeing as how the church functions? What is the relationship of the visible and invisible church in this new context? For example, so looking at how church has often been thought of as a face-to-face embodied experience, but now church, we've experienced it in a mediated context. What is the relationship? Are those separate? Is there intersection? How do we treat those relationships, and how do we negotiate those as online and offline expressions of worship are still an important part of many churches? Also, what are the theological limitations of doing church online? And in the book, we see that people kind of tackle questions like, how does the doctrine, the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the understanding of how Jesus is made present in the bread and wine, how is that impacted when you can't do a communion where the priest is physically present to bless those sacraments? Also, much debate has happened over not just communion, but practices such as baptism, and people even having to put on hold church membership things because realizing that there might be theological limitations on concepts and how we practice our faith in a digital mediated way. And finally, I argue that digital ecclesiology and this book and this kind of this time period gives us a really unique opportunity to rethink the concept and forms of religious community around technology. It forces us to think through to what extent our previous models may be stiff or inaccurate or maybe biased in one direction, and how might the engagement with technology show us new ways to interact that might kind of challenge those formal concepts and models that we've used in theological discourse. So overall, I suggest in the introduction that there's several lessons we can take away from this great experiment of bringing these people together from all over the world, male and female in different cultures, to talk about what's happening in the church. But I argue that churches need to consider the long-term implications of adopting these practices. This was not just a short-term experiment, and some churches may not fully embrace the digital for long-term, but many churches are. And how may this shape the future of the church, how people see it and how people engage in it? And secondly, the experience of moving church online provides grounds for rethinking practical and theological aspects of the church, as I've talked about the concept of community, but also what it means, Christian worship means, and the whole idea of mission. And we need to evaluate to what extent these innovations challenge traditional ecclesiology or give fruitful ground for new conversations in what the future digital ecclesiology should look like. So I hope in your reading of this book that you're challenged by these ideas and that you begin to think yourself what digital theology and digital ecclesiology might mean for you in your own work and ministry.